In 1913, Carl Jung stood at the edge of a precipice, not physical, but psychological. At 38, he had everything the world deemed success: a thriving practice, professional prestige, a devoted family. Yet inside, he felt hollow, as if he were living someone else's life. That year, Jung made a decision that would terrify most people. He deliberately descended into his own unconscious. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious, and what he discovered there would revolutionize psychology forever. Night after night, Jung recorded visions of overwhelming power, ancient figures, archetypal beings, symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning beyond words. His colleagues whispered that he was losing his mind. His mentor, Freud, had already broken with him. But Jung understood something they didn't. He wasn't breaking down, he was breaking through. He was undergoing what he would later call individuation, the most challenging, most essential journey a human being can undertake, the journey to becoming who you truly are. The experience nearly destroyed him. For months, Jung teetered on the edge of madness, unable to distinguish inner vision from outer reality. But he held on, documenting everything, trusting a process he didn't yet understand. And slowly, miraculously, something shifted. The chaos began to organize itself. Patterns emerged. The terrifying figures revealed themselves as parts of his own psyche, disowned, rejected, exiled pieces of himself, demanding integration. By 1916, Jung emerged transformed, not cured or fixed, but fundamentally different, more whole, more authentic, more himself. He had discovered the map of psychological transformation, and he would spend the rest of his life helping others navigate the same treacherous, sacred journey. If you've ever felt like you're living someone else's life, if you've looked in the mirror and wondered who that person really is, if you've achieved everything you were supposed to want and still felt empty, you're standing where Jung stood in 1913. You're hearing the call to individuation. Most people ignore this call. They silence it with work, distraction, substances, relationships that keep them numb. But you can't kill this voice. You can only postpone listening to it. And the longer you wait, the louder it becomes, until one day it erupts as a crisis you can no longer ignore: the midlife breakdown, the existential depression, the sudden realization that you've spent decades building a life that isn't yours. Jung discovered that this crisis isn't a problem to be solved. It's an invitation to the most important work you'll ever do: becoming who you actually are beneath all the masks, roles, and expectations. He called this process individuation, and understanding it doesn't just explain your psychological suffering. It offers a roadmap through it, to the other side, where something extraordinary awaits. Not happiness, not comfort, but something far more valuable: authenticity, meaning, and the profound freedom of finally being yourself. Stage 1. The persona crisis, when the mask cracks. The journey to your true self begins, paradoxically, with recognizing who you are not. Jung called this the persona, the social mask you've constructed to navigate the world, to win approval, to belong. From childhood, you learn which parts of yourself are acceptable and which must be hidden. You craft a personality designed for survival, not authenticity. The good student, the successful professional, the dutiful child, the perfect partner. These aren't lies exactly. They're adaptive strategies. But somewhere along the way, you forgot they were masks. You began to believe the persona is you. Dr. James Hollis, contemporary Jungian analyst, describes this crisis brilliantly. The first half of life is spent constructing a provisional personality, and the second half is spent recovering from it. The persona crisis usually hits in midlife, though it can come earlier. Suddenly, the life that worked stops working. The career that defined you feels meaningless. The relationships that sustained you feel suffocating. The identity you've maintained with such effort collapses, and beneath it, you find nothing, or worse, a stranger. Consider Michael, a composite drawn from Jungian case studies. At 42, he was a partner at a prestigious law firm, married with 2 children, respected in his community. From the outside, his life was perfect. From the inside, he was dying. One morning, driving to work, he found himself unable to move. Not physically paralyzed, psychologically frozen. He sat in his car for 2 hours, unable to enter the building, unable to perform the role one more day. His wife found him there, weeping. "I don't know who I am," he said. "I don't know if I ever did." Michael had reached what Jung called the first threshold of individuation, the moment when the persona can no longer be maintained, when the question, "Who am I really?" becomes impossible to ignore. This moment feels like death, because in a sense it is. The false self must die so the true self can emerge. But most people, terrified by this dissolution, double down on the persona, clinging harder to the roles that are suffocating them. They have what Jung called a resignation to collective norms. They give up on themselves and accept a half-lived life. The practice: begin your individuation by performing what Jung called the persona inventory. List every role you play: professional, familial, social. For each role, write down the qualities you perform in that role. Then ask the most important question of your life. Which of these qualities are authentic expressions of who I am, and which are performances designed to gain approval or avoid rejection? This exercise reveals the gap between your persona and yourself. That gap is where your real work begins. But removing the persona reveals something most people aren't prepared to face: the shadow. Stage 2, the shadow encounter, meeting your darkness. Once the persona cracks, what emerges first is not light but darkness. Jung called this the shadow. Everything about yourself you've deemed unacceptable and exiled from consciousness. Your rage, your selfishness, your weakness, your sexual desires, your cruelty, your neediness. All the qualities that threatened your persona's carefully constructed image banished to the unconscious, where they've been growing in the dark for decades. Jung insisted that shadow integration is the apprentice piece of individuation. You cannot progress without it. The shadow, he wrote, is the foundation for sexual and life instincts. It contains not just darkness, but power, creativity, authenticity, everything vital that you rejected to become acceptable. The shadow is paradoxical. It's both what you most fear in yourself and what you most need to reclaim. Dr. Robert Johnson, Jungian analyst, explains, "We spend the first half of life pushing qualities into the shadow, and the second half trying to get them back out. But the shadow doesn't come quietly. It erupts in projections. You see your own rejected qualities in others and react with disproportionate disgust or fascination. The person who enrages you is showing you your shadow. The person you judge most harshly is reflecting back what you won't accept in yourself." Sarah's story illuminates this perfectly. A therapist herself, she prided herself on compassion, emotional availability, constant giving. But she kept attracting what she called selfish, emotionally unavailable people into her life. Her romantic relationships especially followed this pattern. In Jungian analysis, she discovered a stunning truth. She wasn't attracting these people, she was projecting her own rejected selfishness and emotional boundaries onto them. She had constructed a persona of selfless giving, while her shadow carried all her legitimate needs for rest, reciprocity, and self-protection. Once she recognized this, her relationships transformed. Not because others changed, but because she stopped seeking outside herself what she needed to reclaim within. Shadow work is terrifying because it requires you to acknowledge that you contain the full spectrum of human possibility, including the parts you find shameful. You must admit, yes, I am capable of cruelty. Yes, I am selfish. Yes, I am weak. Yes, I have desires I've called unacceptable. This doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. And paradoxically, only by accepting your darkness can you access your light. The practice. Jung developed active imagination. When someone triggers intense negative emotion, don't dismiss it, investigate it. Write down exactly what you're judging. Then ask, could I possess this quality in a form I don't recognize? The resistance you feel to this question is proportional to how deeply that quality lives in your shadow. This isn't about acting out every dark impulse, it's about acknowledging their existence, which paradoxically reduces their power over you. But the shadow is only the guardian at the threshold. Beyond it lies something even more powerful. Stage 3. The anima-animus integration, embracing your inner opposite. Having confronted the shadow, you encounter what Jung called the masterpiece of psychological development, the anima for men or animus for women. This is the archetypal image of the opposite sex within your psyche, not learned gender roles, but inherited psychological structures representing qualities associated with the other. For men, the anima embodies receptivity, emotion, intuition, and relationship. For women, the animus embodies assertion, logic, action, and penetrating insight. Jung discovered that these figures wield enormous power over your life, especially in relationships. When you fall in love, you're often projecting your anima or animus onto another person. They seem magical, completing, like the missing piece of yourself, because they literally are reflecting back your own unconscious qualities. This explains the devastating disappointment many experience. You fall in love with your projection, then slowly realize the actual person isn't who you imagined. Dr. Marion Woodman, Jungian analyst specializing in feminine psychology, writes, "The anima animus is the soul guide, but if you're unconscious of it, you experience it as fate. You're compelled by attractions and repulsions you don't understand." The key to mature relationship, Jung argued, is withdrawing these projections, recognizing that what you seek in another is actually part of yourself demanding integration. Consider Thomas, who repeatedly fell in love with powerful, decisive women, then grew frustrated when they didn't also provide the emotional nurturing he craved. Jung would see this immediately. Thomas had projected his animus, his own capacity for power and decision, onto these women, while simultaneously expecting them to fulfill the mother archetype. He was seeking completion through relationship rather than developing these qualities within himself. Once Thomas began making decisive choices in his own life and developing his own strength, his relationship patterns transformed. He no longer needed a woman to be powerful for him. He could appreciate her power while standing in his own. The anima/animus also functions as a bridge to the unconscious. Jung noticed that in dreams, figures of the opposite sex often carried messages from the deeper self. Learning to recognize these inner voices, the anima's moods and intuitions, the animus's convictions and insights, becomes a pathway to psychological wholeness. The practice. Identify the qualities you find irresistibly attractive or intensely frustrating in the opposite sex. These reveal your unconscious anima or animus. Then ask, what would it mean for me to develop this quality within myself? This isn't about becoming androgynous. It's about psychological completeness, accessing the full range of human capacity regardless of gender. But all these stages ultimately serve a single purpose: preparing you for the final encounter. Stage 4. The self-realization, becoming whole. The self is Jung's most profound concept, and the most difficult to grasp intellectually because it must be experienced. The self isn't your ego, your personality, or your identity. It's the archetype representing the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, integrated into a unified whole. Jung called it the God image within, the organizing principle of psychological wholeness. Most people never consciously encounter the self. They live entirely identified with their ego, never suspecting they're a small part of a much larger psyche. But the self is always operating, pulling you toward completeness through dreams, synchronicities, crises, and the inexplicable feeling that you're meant to become something more. Jung described individuation as a circumambulation of the self, a spiraling journey that repeatedly circles back to the same psychological territories at deeper levels. Dr. Edward Ettinger in Ego and Archetype explains,
orchestrates the entire individuation process. It's not something you create, it's what you discover when you remove everything that isn't authentically you. This is why individuation feels less like self-improvement and more like self-revelation. You're not building a new personality, you're uncovering who you've always been beneath the conditioning. The self manifests symbolically through universal images, mandalas, circles, quaternity patterns, the divine child, the axis mundi. When these symbols appear in your dreams or capture your attention with peculiar intensity, the self is attempting to communicate. Jung kept a journal of these encounters, eventually published as The Red Book, a testament to what happens when you take the self's communications seriously. Anna's journey exemplifies self-realization. For 43 years, she lived according to others' expectations. Dutiful daughter, supportive wife, selfless mother. Then her husband died, her children left home, and she faced a terrifying question. Who am I when I'm not performing these roles? She entered Jungian analysis and began individuation. She confronted her shadow, the ambition and boundaries she'd called selfish. She integrated her animus, the capacity for decisive action she'd projected onto her husband. And gradually, through years of inner work, she encountered the self, not as a concept, but as a lived reality, a sense of wholeness that didn't depend on any role or relationship. She became, in Jung's language, individuated, uniquely herself, no longer defined by collective expectations. The practice. The self reveals itself through symbols of wholeness. Begin a practice Jung called symbolic attention. Notice when circles, mandalas, or sacred geometry appear in your dreams or daily life. These aren't random. They're the self attempting to communicate. Also, cultivate the feeling that your life has meaning beyond your personal desires, that you're serving something larger than your ego. Jung said, individuation feels like being lived by something rather than living. You become an instrument of your own wholeness. But individuation doesn't end with self-realization. It opens into something even more mysterious. Stage 5. The sacrifice of individuality, transcending the ego. Here's where Jung's teaching becomes truly radical. Individuation isn't about strengthening the ego, it's about transcending it. Having discovered your authentic self, you must ultimately sacrifice even that for something larger. Jung called this the sacrifice of individuality or psychological death, and it's the final threshold most people never cross. Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, explains, people think individuation means becoming special, unique, standing out. But the final stage is the opposite. It's dissolving the ego into service of the self, which is transpersonal. You discover that your individual life is a particular expression of universal life, that your personal psyche opens into the collective unconscious, that you are both unique and intimately connected to all that is. This doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding yourself within something infinite. Jung experienced this in his famous near-death experience in 1944, where he saw Earth from space and realized his individual life was a single note in a cosmic symphony. He returned not diminished, but expanded, more himself than ever, yet free from the prison of ego identification. The practice. Cultivate what Jung called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe your own psyche without being overwhelmed by it. Meditate on the question, what if my individual life is serving a purpose I don't yet understand? This isn't about self-erasure. It's about discovering meaning that doesn't depend on ego gratification. Integration, the individuation protocol. Now you understand the stages: persona dissolution, shadow integration, anima-animus encounter, self-realization, and ego transcendence. But how do you actually walk this path? The 12-month individuation practice. Months 1 to 3. Persona work. Create your persona map. List your roles and qualities. Distinguish authentic expression from performance. Practice saying no to expectations that violate your authenticity. Months 4 to 6. Shadow integration. When triggered, investigate rather than dismiss. Journal about qualities you judge in others. Ask, where does this live in me? Practice acknowledging your darkness without acting it out. Months 7 to 9. Anima/animus work. Examine relationship patterns. What do you consistently seek in others? Develop those qualities in yourself through practice, creative expression, emotional literacy, decisive action, whatever you've been outsourcing. Months 10 to 12. Self-orientation. Begin dream journaling. Practice active imagination. Notice symbols of wholeness. Ask, what wants to emerge through me that's larger than my ego's plans? Ethical warning. Individuation is dangerous. Jung warned against archetypal inflation, identifying with the self rather than serving it. If you start thinking, I am enlightened, or I am special, you've crossed from individuation into possession. The goal isn't grandiosity, it's authenticity. The transformation promise. Those who complete this journey don't just change, they become fundamentally different. They develop what Jung called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe without being overwhelmed. They form relationships based on authentic connection, not projection. They find meaning independent of external validation. They become, in the truest sense, themselves. And in becoming themselves, they serve the world more powerfully than they ever could wearing a mask. In 1913, Carl Jung stood at the edge of his own unknown, terrified but trusting. What he discovered in that darkness wasn't just his own truth, it was a map for all of us. You don't have to wait for a crisis to begin individuation. You can choose it now, consciously, as an act of courage. The persona that's suffocating you, you can remove it. The shadow you're terrified of, you can integrate it. The wholeness you're seeking, it's not out there, it's been waiting inside you all along. This journey will cost you everything you're not. It will require you to sacrifice the false self, confront the darkness, withdraw your projections, and serve something larger than your ego. But what you gain is immeasurable. The freedom of finally being yourself. You are not here to live someone else's life. You are here to become who you truly are. And that journey, the journey to your true self, is the most sacred work you'll ever do. The call is sounding. The threshold is waiting. Will you cross?